The dog had been pulling hard on its leash for 11 straight minutes, and the two young RCMP handlers looked like they were losing a war. Corporal Vickers watched from the edge of the yard, jaw tight, arms crossed. She had called in every resource she could think of. 2 certified K-9 trainers from the National Training Center in Innisfil, a behavioral specialist flown up from Toronto, 3 different handlers who had each managed decorated working dogs for years. Every one of them had spent time with Ghost and walked away with either a torn sleeve or a bruised ego, and in one case, both. The dog wasn't aggressive in any way they'd been trained to recognize. He wasn't lunging at targets. He wasn't responding to threats. He was simply trying to leave. Every muscle in his compact, powerful body was aimed at the gate, his nails tearing parallel grooves in the gravel, his amber eyes fixed on some point beyond the fence that no one else could see. He was a Belgian Malinois, 8 years old according to the file, and he had arrived at the detachment 3 weeks ago with a transfer note that told them almost nothing and a behavioral profile that told them even less. The file called him Asset K4. It said he was a retired federal working dog, cleared for civilian placement. It said he had been medically assessed and found physically fit. It said nothing else that mattered. What the file did not say was why he wouldn't eat unless someone sat beside his bowl the entire time. It did not explain why he slept with his back pressed to the wall and woke screaming in the night, a sound so human in its anguish that the night duty officer had checked twice to make sure it was the dog and not a person. It did not account for the way he watched every door in every room, tracking each one simultaneously with the exhausted vigilance of a soldier who no longer trusted that the world would hold still. Constable Dumont, 26 years old and earnest in the way that only the recently trained can be, dug his heels into the gravel and leaned back against the leash with his full weight. Ghost ignored him entirely. His eyes didn't even flicker. Vickers pulled out her radio. "I need LeBouf out here," she said. "Tell him to bring his coffee." The man who came around the corner of the main building 2 minutes later looked like he had no particular business being on a police training ground. He was in his mid-60s, lean in the way that old soldiers get lean, all function and no excess. He wore canvas work pants and a faded Roots hoodie, and he moved with a quietness that didn't match his size. His hair was white and close-cropped, and there was a long-heeled scar that ran from below his left ear to the edge of his jaw that most people, if they noticed it at all, assumed was from a farming accident or a car crash. His name was listed in the detachment's maintenance contract as Robert LeBouf. He'd been hired 8 months ago on a recommendation from no one anyone could trace to handle general upkeep on the property. He fixed what needed fixing, showed up when he said he would, and spoke to almost no one beyond what the work required. The younger constables thought he was a retired tradesman. The older ones had stopped trying to figure him out. He stopped at the edge of the training yard, a thermos in one hand, and looked at the dog. He stood there for a long moment, not observing the way a trainer would, checking form and technique and response patterns. He was watching the dog the way you watch someone you recognize across a crowded room. Quiet, still, careful. "What's his designation?" he asked Vickers, without looking away from the animal. "They call him Ghost, Asset K4. Came in from a federal transfer. Files mostly redacted." LeBouf nodded slowly, as though she'd confirmed something he already suspected. He set his thermos down on a fence post. "How long has he been like this?" "Since the day he arrived." He watched for another moment. The dog was still fighting the leash, still grinding toward the gate, and then, as if he'd caught something in the wind, his head turned. Just slightly. Just enough. His nostrils flared. Dumont felt the leash go slack for the first time in 11 minutes and stumbled forward a step in surprise. "Sir," called the trainer from Innisfil, a stocky man named Preble, who had spent 20 years working with detection dogs and had never once encountered anything he couldn't eventually bring around. "Sir, I'd strongly advise you not to approach. This animal is unpredictable and we haven't established safe parameters for." LeBouf walked through the gate. Vickers moved to stop him and then didn't. She couldn't have explained why. He walked the way he always walked, unhurried, his weight distributed evenly, no sudden movements, no tension in his shoulders. He didn't approach the dog directly. He moved at an angle, off to one side, and he stopped about 4 meters away and stood with his hands loose at his sides. Ghost had gone absolutely still. The leash in Dumont's hand had gone from a taut cable to a loose rope. The dog's ears, which had been pinned flat in agitation, came forward slowly, tentatively, like antennae searching for a signal. His amber eyes were fixed on the old man with an intensity that made Preble take an involuntary step backward. LeBouf didn't speak. He didn't hold out his hand. He didn't make any of the sounds that trainers make, the low reassuring noises, the quiet commands, the careful nonsense syllables meant to calm a frightened animal. He simply stood there and let the dog find him, because that's what Ghost was doing. Vickers could see it now, the way you sometimes see the answer to something just before it clicks into place. The dog wasn't confused. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was searching. He'd been searching since the day he arrived, pulling toward every gate he could reach, scanning every room, tracking every door. He hadn't been trying to escape. He'd been trying to find something. The wind shifted, carrying across the yard from the direction of the old man, and Ghost made a sound that no one in that yard had ever heard him make before. It was low and broken, the sound of something long held finally coming loose. LeBouf crouched down, not the slow, careful crouch of a man managing risk, but a fluid, easy descent, his body language saying nothing except "Here I am." He said one word. It wasn't a command. It wasn't Ghost. It was a name, 2 syllables, spoken quietly, the way you say someone's name when you've been holding it in your mouth for a very long time. Argus. The dog came apart. There was no other way to describe it. Every wall that had been holding him together since the transfer, every compensating behavior, every vigilance, every frenetic pull toward gates that didn't open onto what he was looking for, it all dissolved in an instant. He surged forward off the slackened leash and hit the old man square in the chest, and LeBouf caught him with both arms and held on, his face buried in the dog's neck, and the dog pressed into him with his whole body, shaking, making sounds that were too raw to be simply animal. Dumont stood holding an empty leash. He was 26 years old, and he had never seen anything like this in his life, and he was fairly certain he never would again. Preble, the trainer from Innisfil, said nothing. He had worked with dogs for 20 years, and he understood, suddenly and completely, that he was in the presence of something he hadn't been trained for. Vickers watched the two of them, the old man and the dog, and felt a pressure behind her sternum that she couldn't name. After a while, LeBouf looked up. His eyes were dry, but just barely. He stroked the dog once along the spine, slow and deliberate, and stood. "His name is Argus," he said. His voice was level. "He answers to that. He doesn't answer to anything else because nothing else is his name." "Where did you know him from?" Vickers asked. She kept her voice professional. It took some effort. LeBouf looked at her for a moment. "We worked together," he said. "For a long time." "Doing what?" He gave her a look that was not unkind and said nothing. She went back to her office and pulled his contract file. It told her that Robert Leboeuf had been born in Chicoutimi, that he had worked in property maintenance for a number of years, that his emergency contact was listed as a post office box in Ottawa. She called the reference number on the contract, got a recorded message, and left a voicemail that she was reasonably certain would not be returned. She then called her superintendent, explained what had happened, and asked if there was anything in the restricted personnel database about a Robert Leboeuf, mid-60s, Chicoutimi. The superintendent called her back in 20 minutes. His voice was careful in a way she had learned to pay attention to. "Leave it alone, Vickers. Sir, he walked onto my training ground and I know what he did. I watched the footage." A pause. "Leave it alone. The dog is where it needs to be. That's what matters." She put the phone down and looked at the training yard through her window. LeBouf was sitting on an overturned feed bucket outside the kennel building. Argus was lying across his feet, his chin on the old man's boot, his eyes closed for the first time since any of them had known him. That evening, Vickers drove to the small house on the edge of town that LeBouf rented from a widow named Sauvé, who had never asked him any questions, and found him exactly as she expected to find him. Alone, at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea he'd stopped drinking, and the dog asleep under his chair. He looked up when she knocked on the screen door but didn't look surprised. "I figured you'd come by," he said. "Come in if you want." She sat across the table from him. The kitchen was clean and spare. There was almost nothing personal in it. No photographs, no mail on the counter, no accumulated evidence of a life being lived. There was a set of books on a shelf beside the window, worn paperbacks, a few Canadian geography texts, something in French that looked technical. On the wall beside the door, at a height that struck her as precise rather than careless, there was a single hook with a single key on it. "I'm not going to file anything," she said. "I just want to understand." LeBouf wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might simply not answer. "I was in the service for 31 years, he said, finally. "Most of it I can't tell you about. Not because I'm being difficult. Just because that's the arrangement." "What kind of service?" "The kind that doesn't have a lot of paperwork." He glanced up briefly. "Or accurate paperwork anyway." "And the dog?" "Argus was my working partner for 6 years beyond. We did our last deployment together in 2019. Something went wrong at the end of it. I won't tell you where or what, because I genuinely can't, but we both ended up in rough shape." He touched the scar on his jaw without appearing to notice he was doing it. "I was told he hadn't made it. I spent 2 years believing that." Vickers looked at the dog under the chair. His paws twitched in his sleep. Whatever he was dreaming, it seemed quieter than the waking hours had been. "They lied to you," she said. "They thought they were protecting me," LeBouf said. "There was no heat in it, just a long-practiced evenness. My situation required a clean break. New name, new location, the whole thing. Having a known working dog in my possession was a liability. I understand the reasoning." He paused. "Doesn't mean it was right? What happened to him after? What happened to any of them?" He turned the mug slowly between his palms. He was reassigned. They tried to retrain him, recondition him to work with someone else, and he stopped. "He's not a malfunctioning tool. He never was. He simply couldn't understand why his partner had disappeared. He'd been doing everything right for 6 years, and then the one thing that made it make sense was just gone." "He's been like that since he arrived," Vickers said quietly. 3 weeks of nothing but that leash and that gate." "I know." LeBouf looked down at the dog. He wasn't running away. He was looking. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a truck went by on the county road. The dog's ear moved once and went still. "How did you end up here?" Vickers asked. "Of all the RCMP detachments in the country, how did you end up 8 months ago in a maintenance job at the one where they were about to send him?" LeBouf was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know if I believe in that kind of thing. But I've been at 4 different postings in the last 2 years, and I think—" He stopped again, chose different words. "I think I was looking too. I just didn't know what I was looking for." Vickers drove back to the detachment and sat in her car for a few minutes before going in. The next morning, she found Preble waiting in her office. The trainer from Innisfil had driven back up from his hotel instead of going home. "I've been doing this for 22 years, he said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her. "I have never seen a dog come down from a state like that in under 30 seconds. Not with medication, not with extended desensitization work, not with anything." He leaned forward. "Whatever that man knows, we don't know it, and I think we should." She called the superintendent again. This call went better. Over the following weeks, the detachment's K9 training protocols were quietly reorganized. LeBouf's maintenance contract was amended. He still fixed what needed fixing, still showed up when he said he would. But twice a week, the training yard was his. He didn't teach the way Preble had expected him to teach. He didn't lecture. He didn't present frameworks or cite research. He walked the handlers through scenarios that seemed almost painfully simple at first, ordinary everyday interactions with the dogs that had nothing to do with commands or control, feeding routines, rest schedules, the specific patience required to let a working dog process a new environment on its own timeline. Constable Dumont, who had been dragged across 11 meters of gravel by Argus on a Tuesday afternoon, and who had subsequently spent considerable time thinking about this, found himself sitting on the ground of the training yard on a Wednesday morning, doing absolutely nothing, while his assigned dog explored the far fence line at its own pace. "This feels wrong," he said to LeBouf, who was standing beside him with his arms crossed and his eyes on the dog. "I know. I feel like I should be doing something." "You are doing something," LeBouf said. "You're being somewhere he can find you. That's the whole job, right now." Dumont watched his dog work its way methodically along the fence line. "How do you know when you've got it right?" "He'll come back," LeBouf said. "Not because you told him to, just because you're where he left you." 3 minutes later, the dog came back. He sat down beside Dumont's knee and looked up at him with an expression that Dumont, who had studied animal behavior in his training program and understood that projecting human emotion onto working dogs was a methodological error, could only describe as acknowledgement. "Huh," said Dumont. "Yeah," said LeBouf. Argus spent most of those sessions lying in a patch of sun near the gate, watching. He was calm in a way that was new. He ate without anyone needing to stay beside him. He slept without pressing his back to a wall. He still tracked every door in every room, but it had the quality now of professional habit rather than survival reflex. He was doing his job. He just happened to also be home. Vickers came to watch one afternoon in late October. The leaves on the maples along the fence line had gone red, and the air had that particular sharpness that comes to northern Ontario in the fall, the kind that makes you feel slightly more awake than usual, whether you want to be or not. Leboeuf was running a young handler named Tran through a scenario she didn't fully understand. Something involving a specific approach pattern and a series of hand signals she hadn't seen in any manual. Argus was involved, working beside the young handler with a seriousness and precision that was completely at odds with the animal who had gouged parallel trenches in the gravel 3 weeks ago. She watched Leboeuf correct Tran once, briefly, with a gesture rather than words. She watched Tran adjust, try again, and get it right. She watched Argus register the change and respond to it, and she thought about a file folder with a redacted name, and a dog who'd been listed as an asset, and a man who had fixed her fence posts for 8 months without her ever thinking to ask him a single real question. Leboeuf noticed her standing there and walked over. Argus came with him, which Vickers was still not entirely used to. The way the dog simply moved when the old man moved, not because he was commanded to, but because it seemed to be the only arrangement that made sense to either of them. "He's a natural," Leboeuf said, meaning Tran. "Where did you learn the hand signals?" Vickers asked. "I don't recognize them." "Different program," he said. "Long time ago. What program?" He gave her the same look he'd given her at the kitchen table. Patient, not unfriendly, completely closed. "Right," she said. "Never mind." He almost smiled. She had the impression he didn't do it very often, that it was something he'd gotten out of the habit of, and that it was slowly, incrementally coming back. "He's going to be all right," Leboeuf said. He wasn't looking at Tran anymore. He was looking at the dog. "Which one?" He glanced at her sidelong, and this time he did smile, just briefly. "Both of them." Vickers nodded. She looked out across the training yard, at the young handlers running their dogs in the thin autumn light, at Dumont sitting deliberately still in the far corner while his dog made its methodical, independent circuit of the fence, at Argus moving at the old man's heel with the ease of something that has found its correct place in the world and settled there. She thought about what it cost to hold something like that together for years in the dark, the specific discipline required to keep going when the thing that had made the work make sense was gone, to build a new life around a new name in a new town and wake up every morning and do it again. She thought about a dog who had tried to dig through gravel with his nails because he was looking for someone. She thought about the way Leboeuf had walked through that gate. No hesitation. Like he'd been walking towards something for a long time and had finally run out of distance between himself and it. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did and for what you're doing now." Leboeuf looked at her for a moment. He started to deflect. She could see it in the slight tightening around his eyes, the habitual reflex of a man who had spent decades making himself unremarkable. Then something in him seemed to relent. "Thank him," he said, and nodded down at Argus. "He found me." The training continued into November. The leaves came down, and the yard went gray, and the mornings got sharp enough to see your breath, and twice a week the gate opened and an old man walked through it with a dog at his heel who no longer needed a leash, and the young constables, who were learning to listen before they gave commands, began, slowly, to understand what it was they were actually being taught. Not obedience, not control, not technique, though technique mattered, and they were learning that too. They were being taught that the bond was the whole thing, that you could not command your way into it, and you could not train your way around the absence of it, and that the most elite handlers in the country had stood in a gravel yard and been undone by a dog who simply knew the difference between a stranger and the person he was made to work beside. Argus knew. He had always known. He had been trying to say so for 3 weeks, at the top of his lungs, in the only language available to him. It just took someone who spoke that language to finally show up and answer.